There weren't that many studios, but when the studio thing started, where people started building studios, everybody needed a console because the old consoles were just broadcast consoles. And a lot of the reason everything was mono because you had a program and an audition switch. And in the early days of stereo, they would just do audition for one channel and program for the other channel. And you had left and you had right. And so people, they didn't have pan pots then, you know? Yeah. So that's why a lot of that early stuff was that way. A lot of the early stuff, because it was written, you know, it was recorded in mono tracks, you know, they could, you know, they didn't have pan pots. They had to put the drums on one side. This is one of the things with the Beatles. And I had a chance to ask George Martin this question one time at a trade show. And I came up to him and everybody's always saying, you know, it's like, oh, I love this record. He did it like that. And I said, I have a very specific question to ask you. And he's like, interesting. I said, so the tambourine in the Beatles stuff, was it because they liked the tambourine a lot, or is it because it added balance to the drums? And he kind of looked surprised. He said, well, there are some instances where the tambourine was what we needed to add to it. But there were other instances because when stereo came out, stereo had not taken off in Europe yet, but in the United States it was huge. And EMI basically said, we need everything in stereo. And we need it tomorrow. So he said nobody really knew what to do with stereo. So they would put some stuff on one side and some stuff on the other. And since your drum tracks were mono, you had to put them on one side or the other. So it really made it sound heavy. So by putting a tambourine on the other side, it balanced it out.
Yeah.
So, you know, here's a medical procedure for a tambourine. Everybody uses a tambourine because the Beatles used tambourines, but they didn't use it entirely because they wanted to. They did it because they needed to balance out the tracks. Now, another thing about those early days, of the early mono days, is Jeff Emmerich said that in a lot of the mixes that they did, because all those Beatle tracks are floating around on the internet. You can download a lot of them. But he said that a lot of those tracks that are floating around, on all of them, there's like one track missing. And he said there were instances when they would have to do something live while they were mixing, or they added something right at the last minute and flew it in, that those didn't make it with the masters, you know.
Oh.
And I mean, this is true with any piece of equipment out there. You know, the guy at Pultec did not design the Pultec equalizer because he thought it'd be cool. And he thought, oh my God, people are going to just think this is the greatest EQ of all time. Somebody came up to him and said, I have a problem. I need you to do this. You know, and so he would design an EQ that had, you know, bass cut and treble boost. And then somebody else would say, well, we'd like to be able to adjust the mid-range. So he'd come up with the, you know, XB-1, you know, and then the XB-2, and then the -2A, because it was kind of like the -2, but it had just one little extra thing. And it builds like that. Now these things are legendary because they were built correctly. They were built by people that knew what they were doing, you know. And so nowadays, people build, more of the stuff is built to be cool than it is built
for functionality
and for reason, you know. So, you know, and that a lot of the older equipment was like that. And a lot of the innovation in electronics was like that. And that's how I was taught by Saul Walker, my friendship with him, because this guy was the smartest guy I ever met in my life. I mean, you would sit there and go like, you know, I like your shirt. And he'd go, yeah, he says, you know, this gold embroidery was invented by a guy and da-da-da-da-da. And the original gold was used to do, you know, kind of like when I tell stories and shit like that, people go like, you know. And I mean, he knew everything about everything. He said, oh, that was a company called so-and-so. And they found out they did this by plating this with that. And, you know, I mean, you ask him anything. And the same thing with Rupert. But both of these guys, okay, they started making consoles. And everybody needed a console. So they sold hundreds of consoles. And then there's a point when everybody had a console.
Then what?
Then what do you do?